We'll get started. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. Welcome to the fifth public lecture in this Archives Public Lecture Series. This is a monthly series, and this is part of some of the events that we're trying to do in the build-up to the opening of the archive, which will be later this year. We'll send you more notices about that if you're interested in that area. It's a particular sort of really thrilled to have Tarangini here, and we've been talking all day today, so I really look forward to the talk. A brief bio. Tarangini Sriraman teaches politics and history at the School of Liberal Studies at Azim Premji University. She recently published her book titled In Pursuit of Proof, A History of Identification Documents in India, and that's also the title of her talk today. She has previously been a South Asia Program Fellow at Cornell University and a visiting Associate Fellow at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. She's also received the Charles Wallace Research Grant in London. Her articles have featured in journals such as the Economic and Political Weekly, Contributions to Indian Sociology, Indian Economic and Social History Review, and South Asia Multidisciplinary Academic Journal. Thank you so much, Tarangini. We look forward to your talk. Thanks.
Okay, so just in case anybody is curious, this is also I also got along my book, and yeah, so it kind of matches. Okay, thanks first of all to Venkat for inviting me here, and I'm quite excited to be speaking to you, and I'm sure this is a very diverse audience, and that your research interests, while they may converge with mine tangentially, I am pretty sure that I would be equally excited to know about the sort of research that you're doing and what brings you here. So afterwards, if there is time to talk about this, let us do so. Okay, so what I thought I'd do today is I'd do a talk that's loosely structured around my book, which is titled In Pursuit of Proof, A History of ID Documents in India. So I wanted to start by actually giving you an overview of my research and an overview of what exactly the theme of my book is, which is an urban history of identification documents in India, right? So in this, I'm quite interested in, or quite taken aback that the identification document features as a much proliferating, much circulating, often spoken about thing in social sciences, right? I mean, and also in our everyday lives, right? So the word ID must conjure all sorts of images in your mind, right? It might conjure images, and as well as certain emotions, as well as certain stimuli, really, when you think about documents like PAN cards and ration cards and electoral rolls and voter IDs. So what then becomes even more interesting is that even though this is a much spoken about and much circulating object, right, in our everyday lives, and also tangentially, it does touch on so much of scholarship in the social sciences, and it touches on so much of what journalists also think about and work with, right? And of course, in recent times, there has been an efflorescence of writing on IDs, whether it is by scholars, whether it is by journalists, whether it is by policy people who are working in the policy area, right? So yet, how is it that a certain history of this genre, the history of this object, is something that has not been written about really? It's not been recorded. It's not something that has been attempted, at least not in the systematic manner that I'm going to try and present to you today. Right? So my book in that sense is a history of the identification document and how it circulates in law, bureaucracy, and the marginal spaces of the urban poor. When I say marginal spaces of the urban poor, I mean spaces such as slums, spaces which are inhabited by refugees, spaces which are inhabited by rural migrants, and all of them are going to feature in my talk today, right? So what is it that such a history allows us to do? A history that looks at an urban lives of identification documents, right, urban aspects of identification documents, is one that will allow us to decenter the state. Because far too often, when we speak about IDs, the problem is that we have this image of a sovereign state bearing down on its passive subjects, right? And so we have a top-down approach to the state, which this urban history will try to dismantle them, right? And so in that sense, we are equally interested, at least I am equally interested, in questions of claim making, and not simply questions of how proof is produced in a holistic sense, in this overarching sense by states which act in a sovereign manner. So simply put, we can think of IDs as being not simply the outcome of sovereign states issuing them, but we can think of IDs as being the byproduct of popular engagement with states, right? That's what I'm going to try and do. So the argument that runs through my book, that runs through various chapters in my book, essentially is that the state governs its subjects through popular knowledge practices, through popular infrastructures, through popular notions, and through popular imagination of what proof is. And by proof, you will see how I'm going to walk you through different notions, different definitions, and different ideas of proof. It sometimes is proof of identity, sometimes it's proof of entitlement, sometimes it is proof of urban presence, sometimes it is proof of occupation. When I say occupation, I don't mean trade, but I mean occupying a space, right? So we'll look at all of that as we go along. So I'm sorry I'm doing this to you. I mean, many of you might not even be from a social sciences background, and but I think this is necessary to understand what my talk is on today, and what my book attempts to do within the space of scholarship on IDs such as it is, right? It's a very dispersed sort of space, right? It's a space where all sorts of scholars, internationally speaking, have made interventions. So we need to, if we're talking about a history of IDs, we need to be pitching it, and we need to be placing it and positioning it also within an international arena, right? Because we don't exist insularly. Okay. So in that sense, I'm going to very quickly try and summarize a couple of theories of the state, right? The modern state, as they have been formulated by scholars, and I'm going to try and tell you where I stand within these theories, because it is important to get to this in order to try and also understand how IDs relate to the modern state, and because we can't overlook that altogether. So a couple of very famous theories that have featured, right? And these are theories of the state that have featured, and these do touch on this whole process of identification and documenting subjects. The first theory is that the state can govern well only when it replaces local social practices with standardized practices. So James Scott, who comes up with this theory in his famous book, Seeing Like a State, argues that you have what is called the high modernist state, and the high modernist state is one that seeks to make its subjects, the subjects that it governs, the subjects that it enumerates, it seeks to make those subjects legible to itself, visible to itself, right? And in order to make subjects visible to itself, the state undertakes all sorts of measures and practices which are of a universal nature, which are of a standardized nature. And so what that essentially implies is you have the state carrying out censuses, right? Censuses of people and their trades and their caste maybe, or their races, and the arable land that they have, right? And it also carries out cadastral surveys, which collects, wherein the state collects revenue-based information. Then it also collects information that is necessary for taxing subjects, right? Then it also issues passports. Then the state also undertakes to standardize names, right? Place names, people's names, so on and so forth. So it is necessary for it to do all of this in order to govern its society better, right? So this is a theory in its very bare bones skeletal form that James Scott presents to us. Now, I have a problem with this, and by the way, you might be wondering, what is this whole entity of the modern state? I mean, there have been many attempts to date the modern state. Essentially, one of these attempts essentially is to date the modern state to the Treaty of Westphalia, which is essentially a treaty that follows war, a 30 Years' War, in which there are attempts made to put in place a system of sovereign boundaries, right? So and this happens in the mid 17th century. So one can perhaps date the modern states to this, though there are several other interpretations which we will not go into. So my problem with James Scott's argument is essentially this, which is that Scott seems to suggest that it is necessary for the state to replace all these local, diverse, complex social practices with standardized practices. But I'm going to argue today that in non-Western context, and particularly in the Indian context, it is true that modern states have to rely excessively on local social practices in order to govern them better, right? And that's what I'm going to be arguing. The second theory is that modern states enjoy a monopoly over the legitimate means of movement. So John Toppy, who makes this argument in his equally famous book, Invention of the Passport, The Invention of the Passport, he is talking of how modern states are in the business of making sharp distinctions between citizens and non-citizens, right? And how do they make these distinctions? Through processes of inscribing identities, wherein they create ID documents. They create documents like the passport. They create national ID documents. And through these documents, they're able to sustain these distinctions. Now, what's interesting is that during the time of war, like the First World War, Second World War, this becomes much more pronounced. Modern states begin to acquire a monopoly over the question of who gets to go out and who gets to come in, right? And so that's more or less his arguments. So again, I have a problem with what Toppy is saying as well, because the problem as I see it is that modern state processes of identification, or for that matter, any state processes really, are not straightforward, are not logical, they're not coherent, they're very messy, right? And they're very inchoate. So you are not, as a state, it's not really going to be possible to sharply delineate people such that they are either citizens or non-citizens. And as I will show you, the people I interviewed, the people I spoke to, the people who figure in the archives that I worked with, are people who reside in the limine, who reside in between spaces, in between the legal and the illegal, between the formal and the informal, between spaces which can be called legitimate and spaces which are overlooked by the state, right? So we will look at how all of this works out. So another thing that I'm going to be arguing is that the very form of the identification document changes depending on the class of subjects we're talking about. So again, John Toppy's theories seem to assume that state processes of identification are universal for all classes, right? And that's again something that we're going to try and disrupt. Okay, so now I'm going to get into the body of my talk, and this, by the way, this whole history of fingerprinting, which I'm going to now talk to you about, is something that doesn't really feature in my book, not to a very great extent, because the history that I am plotting is one that spans the period from 1940, which is the time of the Second World War, to the time of the production of Aadhaar and post-Aadhaar, if I may call. We're not in the age of post-Aadhaar, we're very much in the age of ongoing Aadhaar, okay. Okay, so what I should now draw your attention to is that there's a technology that predated the creation of Aadhaar, or the technology that can be traced as far as 150 years back in India, is the technology of fingerprinting. So today it has a more sophisticated term called biometrics, right? But back in the day, you had this technology which, in its inception, was something that was highly fascinating for the people who experimented with it. And here I am going to tell you a few stories, narrate to you a few stories really, of a few men, right? All of whom were obsessed with fingerprinting, and of course all of them were colonial administrators and English. So the first man is William Herschel, and William Herschel was a colonial administrator who served in a few administrative positions after the 1857 revolt, and Herschel served as a collector and a magistrate of a few districts in Bengal presidency, that is to say Hooghly and Nadia district in Bengal. And so there he was, there he became slowly obsessed with fingerprinting, which he was eager to try out in various places such as the sites of the Indigo agitation, the pensions office, the jail's office, and the registrar general's office. So what is interesting is that several of the arguments that Nilekani is making today, right, about the infallibility of biometric technologies, a certain decisiveness, a certain foolproofness that this technology enjoys is something that Herschel was making back in the day, right? But what is it that inspired Herschel? And that's equally an important story because that goes to the heart of the argument that I am making in some senses also. So Herschel was quite stirred by many of the things that he saw around him. One of the things that he observed was illiterate peasants in the Bengal presidency using what is called, and please forgive my atrocious Bengali pronunciation, tepshoy, which is essentially the thumbprint, right? So illiterate peasants who needed to sign would use the tepshoy and as a means of signing, and so that's something that caught his attention. But apart from that, he would also see Bengali women who would use what he called red dye or vermilion to apply on their foreheads, right? Then apart from that, he also noticed, so he also noticed something like this, which is he saw that there were several Bengalis who ended up signing, right, in the local language, that is Bangla, but next to that, they would also draw the symbol of the caste that they were from, right? So for instance, you have a cultivator who would draw a harrow, a barber would draw a mirror, a shopkeeper would draw scales, carpenter chisel, washerman would draw washerman's board, so you get the idea, right? Okay, so all of this got him thinking, and he felt that he could now begin to collect fingerprints. First he collected palm prints, then he moved on to fingerprints, and then he would kind of pounce on anybody who's very important, right? And of course he collected fingerprints also of people who were locals, but several important personalities, administrative personalities, like whether it be the captain of police or the magistrate or some magistrate from some other district, or whether it is the surgeon or some medical officer. He would collect their fingerprints assiduously, and he would keep a collection of them. And what is more, he shared them with this famous eugenicist and a scientist who was also a freak, right? In the sense that he too was obsessed with fingerprinting, and he was a freak in another sense as well, because he was a man who believed that it was possible to establish the monkey-like patterns of Asiatic fingerprints, right? So that was his thing. So he shared notes with this man, and Francis Galton was this man who happens to also be the cousin of, guess who? Charles Darwin, right? So he shares notes with Francis Galton, and then they let something like 15 to 20 years pass, and the duration, of course, varies across these people. And then he chances upon these people. He doesn't chance upon them. He actually meets them quite deliberately, and he also gets Galton to meet some of them. And then they compare the fingerprints and they're able to then argue about the persistence of patterns. And I'm quoting from William Herschel's book called The Origin of Fingerprinting. Right? And so meanwhile, he tries it out in all these places. He tries it out in the site of indigo agitation, the pensions office, jail's office, and the Registrar General's office. And I don't have too much time to go into detail about all of this, but I'm just tempted to share with you one nugget, which is that as far as the jail's office is concerned, he saw that several convicts were doing what he felt was quite atrocious, which is they were getting others to serve out their sentences. They were, that is to say, these convicts were experts in the whole businesses of, or the scams of impersonation, right? And they would also get convicts, and this is something that is much more rare, but it happened, where one convict would get a corpse such that he could fake his own death, right? And so he felt that fingerprinting, especially if it is used in the jail warrants and in the court records, would put an end to this sort of fraud. Okay. Moving on, and I have to now touch on the technology of anthropometry, which is used. So it's here what's fascinating is that anthropometry was something that was experimented with after William Herschel. So after William Herschel, it is interesting that the colonial administration did not see the value of fingerprinting immediately. And it took a few decades before they came around. And in the meantime, there were a bunch of anthropologists, ethnographers, and a bunch of people who were also police experts, right, who came into the picture. And here, some of the names to note, the most famous being Edward Henry. Edward Henry was an Inspector General in Bengal, and at some point, much later, he was also enjoyed prominence as the police commissioner of the Scotland Yard. So Edward Henry was really obsessed with bringing anthropometry to India, and of course he was inspired by the famous Alphonse Berthelon, right? And Alphonse Berthelon was actually started off his career as a lowly clerk in the prefectures of the Paris police, right? And he, however, is credited with coming up with the most systematic classification of anthropometry. Now, what is anthropometry? Anthropometry is the science of measuring body parts, right? The science of arriving at the proportions and measurements of body parts. So, Alphonse Berthelon had his own set of measurements, and I'm just going to read out some of those because I don't want to narrate them from memory. Right, so he used several measurements of these. They were the height of the individual, the length and breadth of his head, span of his arms, height while sitting, width of the cheek, length of the left middle finger, the little finger, the foot, the forearm, and the right ear, among other things. So bony parts of the body were to be particularly measured, right? So that is what lent itself to proper measurement, and so that's something he insisted on. So Edward Henry decided that he would use only 6 of the 11 measurements. And if you want to know more, you can just read Chandak Sengupta's Imprint of the Raj, right? And I don't want to go into excessive detail here. So the thing is, now I have to tell you this, and because this is of great provocative value, right? So there were a lot of anthropologists around that time, right? There was Herbert Risley, and there's also Edward Thurston. Edward Thurston comes up with this compendium called Castes and Tribes in Bengal. To Herbert Risley, we must credit the first caste census in India in 1901. So these men were also very obsessed with anthropometry for different reasons. Now, Herbert Risley felt that castes in India did not intermarry. They married within themselves, and hence you could arrive at pure body types and pure caste types. So all you need to do is systematically measure and evaluate the bodily features of Indians to arrive at a ranking order or ranking scheme of superior castes, right? So that was the connection he made. So what that essentially entailed was people like Edward Thurston would bait at the Madras Museum and other places, and then they would kind of pounce on Indians, and then get hold of calipers and rulers and all sorts of instruments which were even seen as torture instruments, and they would try and measure especially the forehead and all of that. Herbert Risley actually believed that the width of the nose was in inverse proportion to the intelligence of a man, right? So those are the kinds of notions that they worked with, right? And now, what is it that anthropometry was used for in India? It was used for two things, or for the study of two groups really. One was those who were termed recidivists or habitual criminals, those who had committed offences from the IPC more than twice, right? Or and also anthropometry was to be used in putting together the systematic record of classifications of body parts, as well as the thumbprint to start with of the criminal tribes in India, right? The criminal tribes in India are those who are seen to be criminal by birth or heredity, right? And so you have all sorts of police manuals and records of those who have been dubbed criminal tribes. And of course now, post-independence, they were denotified, and now we know them to be the scheduled tribes also, right? So that's that history. Okay, so I am just going to complete this part of my history by simply noting that anthropometry did not win, right? And it lost out to fingerprinting, so to speak, because Edward Henry himself understood or realized that it was too time-consuming, that the kinds of resources that were needed to train officials, not officials but clerks and assistants, was too much, and it took as much as 1 hour to narrow down suspects, and that's all it entailed. Narrowing down of suspects is what anthropometry promised. It did not promise to establish a culprit's identity in terms of certitude, rather in probabilistic terms, right? So fingerprinting, on the other hand, especially with the kind of systematic classification that Edward Henry, along with 2 Indians, came up with, narrowed down the time of nabbing of zeroing in on the culprit to something like 5 minutes, even back in around 1891, right? So that's quite remarkable, I suppose. Okay, so now I move on to the parts which become very significant to my book as well. So this is a story of the origins of the rationing document or the ration card in India. So in order to understand this, I need you to go back with me, travel back with me to the period of the Second World War, which is when ration cards were introduced in India for the first time, right? And so the story of the ration card in India is also the story of the bureaucratic construction of certain welfare norms of family and residence, right? And why is this the case? So what we know today to be proof of family, proof of address, is something that we can date back to this era, right? And what we know to be the factum of residence, which a lot of officials, it's a term that has so much elegance for me, factum of residence. Anyway, so during the time of the Second World War, colonial authorities felt the need to introduce and even impose rationing for several reasons. First of all, there was the famine of Bengal, a severe famine. Then apart from that, a regular supplier of rice, Burma, had come under attack, right, by Japan, and so they couldn't depend on their normal channels of food supply, and hence they had to have other means of procuring food grains. They also had to deal with the scarcity that entailed. And apart from that, there were of course other reasons, pressing reasons, such as the war itself, right? The war itself meant that the industrial sections and those living in the city had to be well-fed, right? And so certain priority sections had to be well-fed in particular. And who are those priority sections? They were soldiers, policemen, laborers, heavy manual laborers, Then there were mill hands, industrial workers, peasants, right? So all of them had to be protected, and so rationing was needed for them, right? And also the industrial war supply base was also in the city, so the cities also had to be protected. So for all these reasons, you had rationing of essential and non-essential items, and the essential items here were, the food grains, wheat and rice, and kerosene and sugar for the most part, and the non-essential items were what is called motor spirit or petroleum, and tires and tubes, cement, electricity, among other things. Okay, so what you had was a territorial administrative grid that emerged, which entailed several classifications. So it was important to regulate the movement of food grains between various zones, that is to say surplus and deficit zones, but even within a particular city or a town, you had to have a classification of, so the city or the town had to be classified into zones, which opened out into circles, which then opened out into rationing offices, and then which opened out into ARDs. I forgot to actually insert a slide of the Delhi rationing map, which anyway. So all this essentially meant that you had different categories emerging. So what you know today to be the head of the family, right, the dependents, so much of that again dates back to this era, right, and so again it was very important to mention your address, right, and so you had also categories like the dealer and the distributor. ARDs were authorized retail distributors, which today we know to be fair price shops, right? Okay, so how was it that people ended up knowing about this whole process, right? Those who were governed, the colonial subjects, how did they know about their rights pertaining to ration cards? And so you had like the splash of advertisements, almost bordering on propaganda really, telling you about how much the colonial state cared for its subjects. And you had ads such as how to use your ration card, do you know your rationing number, don't just give information about your address and everything else to a random stranger, ask for the food official's ID, right, and what to do when you lose your ration card. So all of these ads featured in a big way in the Hindustan Times, which whose archives I went through. Okay, so just to give you a sense of what ration cards looked like, this is what the ration cards issued in Karachi looked like, which was very much a part of India at that time. It's a bilingual ration card, as you can see, in both in English and in Urdu. This is a food-based ration card, and this is the ration card issued to children in Bengal, right? And so you had a deluge of rationing documents for different classes, really. Then you had a sample of special ration card for those who were termed priority sections. This is the heavy manual laborer and the supplementary ration card that was used. And it's important to note here that certain genres of rationing documents emerged as a result of popular demand and popular protesting, right? So there were classes who said, what the hell, we want extra rations to travel to church. We want extra rations to do puja for our deities, right? And we want extra rations so that we can actually do your work, that is to say, do propaganda for the war, right? We are part of a moving theater company and we want extra rations for that. Then we want rations also because how do we celebrate our festivals? I mean, how do you expect us to break fast, right? So Muslims wrote saying that we want extra sugar to break fast, and so you had Sikhs saying that the langar, sorry, I'm very bad with pronunciations. So the langar also needed extra rations, so we can't make do without that. So you had several communities threatening to riot if they didn't get extra rations. So some of these ration cards are the result of such protests. The Textile Mazdoor Union protested, saying, yeah, we can't work with these kinds of quotas of textiles. And the Dhobis said, we want more coal, right? I mean, how do you expect us to do what we do, right? So anyway, so then this is a copy of the rationing certificate for the wife of the soldier, right? Okay, so if you want to do this tacky thing of looking at ration cards across time scales. There is a ration card issued in Karachi in the 1940s, and this is what ration cards look like today, right? Okay, so moving on. So now I'm going to jump to another tale altogether. So this is the story of the popular making of identification documents. The argument that I was making about how you would not have identification documents without the popular ingenuity, without popular innovations, right, and enterprise. So in order to understand that, we need to know the story of the partition, post-partition, how rehabilitation and identification of refugees happened. So how did the state even attempt to know who the refugee was? Because you couldn't just dole out rehabilitation benefits and compensation to people without knowing them intrinsically, right? And in order to know them intrinsically, the Indian state, to start with, issued something called a refugee registration certificate. And this is what the refugee registration certificate looked like, for instance. So the refugee registration certificate was issued to all those refugees living in camps, relief camps or refugee camps that were set up by the government of India. And there are a lot of communal aspects to this. If you want, I can get into later on, but I don't have the time for this. Muslims and Hindus were treated differently. And if you want, we can get into that in the question round. So essentially, however, refugee registration certificates were issued to, and here, by the way, let me also warn you that both my Second World War chapter and my the partition chapter, as well as the rest of my book, really is set in Delhi, right? And I'm looking at IDs within two realms of food distribution and housing. So I'm working in that very limited kind of, with that limited mandate, right? So please don't expect me to be a historian of IDs anywhere and everywhere in India. So, I should also therefore tell you, and why I brought this up now was because I looked only at refugees from West Pakistan who came to Delhi, that is to say the Hindu and Sikh refugees who came from West Pakistan to Delhi. I did not look at the East Pakistan refugees in Delhi because the East Pakistan refugees were a very small pocket. There was a very small community which settled in CR Park mainly, but you don't really have them in any sizable numbers. It's only with the creation of Bangladesh that happens, and I don't look at that. Anyway, so the Hindu and Sikh refugees were given very short window of time, right, to register for the refugee registration certificate, to acquire the refugee registration certificate, right? And many Hindu Sikh refugees did not manage to make it in this window. They lost their window. And so the state could not possibly tell them, the post-colonial Indian state could not tell them, you don't have a registration certificate, you don't qualify as a refugee. It couldn't say that. So for those, it had to recognize other criteria, other kinds of proof of who a refugee was, right? And in my case, because I also look at another category of those who are called urban displaced squatters, right? Those who are called displaced squatters, or those who squatted illegally, unauthorizedly occupied various spaces, whether it is a setting up of slums or whether it is the occupation of buildings that were set up by the government, right? Occupation of colonies that were created by cooperative groups or by the government itself. So they squatted in various areas. So I became interested in looking at how these urban displaced squatters tried to prove A, that they were refugees, B, that they occupied these spaces, and because they were refugees, they could not just be told, just go away, right? They couldn't be told to go away. They had to be given some sort of compensation. So then, I was also interested in looking at how refugees were seeking to produce proof of who they were and what they had studied, where they were employed before. Because if they wanted education, if they wanted employment in India, in cities and towns, then they would have to show some proof of what they were doing earlier. And this is the problem with the post-partition identification regime, that it constantly sought out, solicited evidence of what people were doing, where they were living, how much property they owned, in order to give them compensation, right? So one of the baselines I think I'll get to that in a bit. One of the baselines of the partition compensation regime was, especially in the realm of housing, was you need to be able to show us how much movable, immovable property you owned. In the realm of education, you had to demonstrate that you had passed a certain grade, you had passed, you'd acquired a degree, right, for class 11 or whatever. And so then these refugee associations began to form in great number and in great complexity, right? So you had associations formed along various axes of region, religion, ethnicity, caste, occupation, but also residential status. So you had the Arya Samaj's Refugee Association, you had the Khudai Khidmat Association, you had, let's see, the Hawkers Associations, you had the Non-Allottees Association, so you had Evictees Association, right? So all of this. So then these associations came up with these brilliant kinds of proof, alternative proof, substitute proof. So they would say, look, some of these refugee associations argued and reasoned with the government, and they said, we don't possess refugee registration certificates, but we can prove that we are refugees by other means. And how would we do that? So a teacher who's also a refugee, a principal who's also a refugee, traveled across borders and is now in the same city, same town as us. So we will get an affidavit or a declaration by that teacher or principal saying that this person finished such and such a grade, and this becomes both proof of educational status, and this also becomes proof of refugee status, right? So these are the kinds of workarounds they came up with. In the realm of housing, the kinds of workarounds were immense. So if you were to look at these two columns, proof that I'm a refugee, the refugee association, by the way, prepared the template for this. It is not the government that prepared the template. It is the refugee association that prepared the template for this declaration. And there, proof for the refugee is affidavit, right? And I have no idea what that affidavit is. But the second is proof for the date of occupation of the present quarter. So you had to prove that you had occupied a quarter, right? To show that you were a squatter, you had to show that you occupied the city and occupied a particular space. And there they're producing postcards. They're saying, look, we got postcards. And so this couldn't have been possible if we were not staying in the space at this point in time. Okay, so moving on, so you get a certain sense of the ingenuity, right? The popular ingenuity of the refugees, right? So now we need to move to another story which also overlaps with the same period, more or less, which is that so far I've presented to you a really somewhat rosy picture, right, of how people who were governed, identified, enumerated were very resourceful, and that they came up with all these ingenious ideas and plans, right, and showed the government, this is how you identify us, right? Take evidence from our journeys, our narrations, our life experiences, right? But now I should also kind of give you a sobering picture and present you a sobering picture, because identification processes were very casteist, they were very gendered as well, right? And to understand that, I'm going to draw on somebody else's book, right? Ornit Shani's work called How India Became Democratic. Again, immense archival work. She's done this immense archival work, and she traces the history of India's democracy by looking at the story of how India's electoral rules were made, right? And she looks at it at the time of the making of the constitution, right? And so then she talks of how early on, and this is much before the partition, when franchise was initially given to Indians under the ambit of the Government of India Act 1935, limited franchise was given, and there were all sorts of restrictive criteria of who could vote, right? Essentially, there were all sorts of communal criteria that were used. You had to be a Hindu or a Muslim or an Anglo-Mohammedan or a Christian or Anglo-Christian or something like that, right? So there were all these restrictive communal criteria. Apart from that, there were also criteria such as you had to be literate, you had to show that you were propertied, you had to show that you were tax paying, and of course women could not tick most of these boxes, right? And many of them were therefore not part of the electoral rolls. And those women who could show that they were propertied, Ornit Shani talks about how back in the day, in around 1935, a little after that, there were some women in the Meghalaya and in the Khasi Hills in Meghalaya who could show that they were in fact propertied, right? But then the colonial authorities found a way of getting around that, and they said, well, you know, these women are not used to exercising public functions, so let's just leave them out. And even when women managed to make it to the electoral roll, how were they mentioned? They were mentioned as wife of, daughter of, widow of, right, and not in their own names. So now what happens is, with the partition and with independence, you have the first Chief Election Commissioner of India, Sukumar Sen, arguing that everybody should register in their own names. We should have universal franchise. None of this limited criteria business, right? I mean, of course, there were some criteria. You had to be of a certain age, etc. And you could not be unsound of mind, and there's all that, of course, going. What the Election Commission was presented with was this conundrum, where refugee associations told women in their midst, and refugee families told the women within their midst that, look, we want you to only enter the electoral roll as wife of or as daughter of. So you had something like 200,000 women who entered as something like this, a relation of, right, in the United Provinces. And Sukumar Sen throws a fit and says, these women can't enter the electoral roll. That's it, away with them. So therefore you had all these sorts of very patriarchal and extremely non-permissive and regressive attitudes really to registration. But what happened to women refugees, right? What happened to their claims of compensation, their chances of getting compensation, right? Whether it's fields of education, employment, housing. And here, what is startling is, in 1947, mind you, not any colonial piece of legislation, but in 1947, there is a piece of legislation that is passed. This is called the Delhi Refugee Registration Ordinance. And in this ordinance, it is stated in no unclear terms that it is only the male head of the family who can register everybody in his care as refugees. And these include women, children, lunatics, and idiots. Right? So therefore, a woman refugee could not register in her own name. That's again a sobering fact that we need to remember. Okay, and also in all the files that I looked at, the National Archives files that I looked at, one could also see how women refugees, when they attempted to show proof to housing authorities, those who conducted surveys and those who were hearing depositions, their claims and their depositions seemed to be very suspect if they presented their own proof. If they presented proof of their husbands, ration cards of their husbands were easily admitted. But when they submitted their own ration cards to show that they were occupants of such and such a quarter, then the authorities were extremely suspicious. And yeah. Okay, and now if we need to also especially speak of how identification processes were also very casteist, right? And so in this sense, you had any number of Dalit refugees from West Pakistan, 5,000 refugees, at least that's a official estimate that features in the letters of Nehru, the writings to and by Nehru, right? So Dalit refugees were not given admission to refugee camps, right? And they were not given admission to refugee camps by upper caste refugees residing in these camps. So they would turn them away. And if you were not living in a refugee camp, then you couldn't register, right? So it is only with the intervention of Ambedkar and this organization called the Harijan Sevak Sangh, which was set up by Gandhi back in the day, in the 1930s. It is owing to their intervention that Dalits were able to overcome this hurdle, and the archives are not very clear how they overcame this hurdle. and they were able to secure registration eventually. As it turns out, Dalits did receive housing compensation in sizable amount. But there was a lot of discrimination even there, which we'll not get into in great detail. But I have to mention here that all that I mentioned about the onus on producing proof, the necessity to produce proof of property especially, was something that weighed very heavily on Dalit refugees because they could not really produce evidence to this effect because many of them were landless, many of them were tenants, right? Many of them had lost their pattas. Others could require the Pakistan government to go to their Jamabandi records, which is a record of land rights, and in order to show that they possessed land, right? And they weren't able to do any of this. So there were very few Dalits who managed to convince authorities in that sense, but thankfully the Harijan Sevak Sangh did step in and did do some important work in this regard, and there were rehabilitation work that was undertaken, whether it was in the realm of housing or in the realm of other social services. There was work that was undertaken in this regard. But what is really cause for reflection is one of the government posts, especially in terms of employment that Dalits got, was that of sweepers, right? Because that is what the Pakistan government employed them as, I mean, back in the day. And this is what they readily got. So the Valmiki caste, for instance, were predominantly employed as sweepers by the free Indian states. Okay, and the last thing that I need to mention here, and I mean, of course, what I just said goes to the point that ownership of property is a baseline, which many Dalits didn't quite qualify for. But the other interesting and important thing to mention here is that, and this is going to be very familiar to you, right? So the possession of a document obviously does not necessarily, and many times really doesn't result in enjoying that entitlement. So having a ration card even today, food security card, is not going to necessarily entail that you will get the rations that are promised you. Your biometrics may fail. There are a whole lot of reasons, right? So if you were to look at it back then, so you had Dalits who were being issued ration cards too, but their ration cards did not enjoy the same rights as those of upper caste refugees. And why was this? This is because they would be given lesser kerosene, lesser good or jaggery, lesser rations compared to upper caste refugees by these dealers who would be upper caste, and many of these dealers would also be upper caste farmers, right, and landlords. And so you had the power differential working to ensure that they didn't get rations. So we need to remember all of this as well. Okay, so I'm going to unfortunately jump to another phase in the history of IDs, and there's also a missing phase which features in my book, which I don't have the time to talk about, which is the phase of the license Raj. So if you have questions about that, you can ask me in the question round. I'm just going to move to another phase altogether. And this is, in some sense, is the high point in my book because it features field work. I mean, I've worked with this subject over the course of something like 3 years on and off, and this has involved field work that I did in a slum in South Delhi, which is called Govindpuri. So here I make this argument that citizenship claims need to not simply be politically cast, they need to be materially born, right? So it is not enough to say that I have been a resident of India for these many years, as many of you would know with the NRC especially, right? So if necessary for Indians and for certain marginal subjects especially, to assiduously, diligently prove that they qualify under several brackets, right? Within several brackets. So what are these brackets, and how is it that the stakes of the urban poor to the city and to citizenship are so intense, right? That's something that I'm going to try and walk you through, right? This field project that features in my book as part of this larger history has centered around this important, obscure, and in some parts at least a progressive initiative, which I am going to be calling the VP Singh Enumeration Initiative, which essentially entailed the production of three important documents, or artifacts, if you can call them that. One is the ration card, of course. The second is the metallic token. I have pictures of that. So this is the metallic token, which, by the way, has oxidized over time, and so it's faded into the background. It's already, oh dear, I will have to, so give me 5 more minutes, 5 to 10 minutes. So anyway, I will go back to that very quickly. So, so the ration card, the metallic token, and an ID document which is called the VP Singh card, which I will show you pictures of in a bit. So the point of all these three documents was now slum residents in Delhi would enjoy certain things. They would enjoy a fixed postal address. They would enjoy fixed rations for 5 years at least. Then they would also enjoy reassurance against demolition, arbitrary demolition without compensation, right? These were the promises that were given to them. So why was this such a remarkable initiative? Because VP Singh in 1990, which is the first 3 months of 1990 was when this initiative unfolded, gave strict orders to his food administration saying, do not demand any proof. Do not ask for any proof, right, in order to issue these documents. And so you cannot go into a slum resident's house and then demand to see what proof of identity he has, or what proof of occupying that space she has, or familial status. You can't ask questions like this. You just have to issue these documents. Now, how this happened is a different story, and I don't have the time for that. So if you again are curious, you can ask me questions about that. But this was a remarkable initiative. Also, if you were to understand the whole premise of identification of slum residents and the issuing of entitlements, giving entitlements to slum residents. To understand this very quickly, an excerpt from Rohinton Mistri's novel A Fine Balance, which is that in this novel there's a exchange that happens between two slum residents on the one hand and the rations officer. And the rations officer is asking the residents to fill out this application form, and then they begin to fill out the address, and then he says, what is this rubbish? A jhoppadpatti, or a slum in Hindi, is not an address. The law says ration cards can only be issued to people with real addresses, right? And so even though they live in a slum, that slum doesn't really have a legal existence, right? I mean, you now have different classifications of slums and different legalities that slums enjoy, but in theory, you can't really give them these rights as if they were entitled to them. Okay, so I don't have time to go into the the topography of the slum that I worked in. Again, if you have interested, we can talk about it. So, but the important thing to mention here, and we can move on, is that there are certain temporal criteria of urban citizenship that have always mattered in questions of, or in realms of identifying marginal subjects. It is not enough to show that you occupied a certain space. It is important to show that you occupied a certain space at a certain point in time, right? So this initiative, what it did was, it came up with date lines of entry to the city and said, those who came after 1990 and occupied a slum will not be given any compensation. Their slums can be demolished. And these kinds of date lines keep getting revised, right? In 2004, there was another set of date lines. So what you notice is that owing to these date lines, there's a world of emotions that is unleashed on people like this, right, slum residents, because they often worry at the time of housing surveys. So I don't have a VP Singh card. I came after 1990. So then does that mean that I'm not going to get a plot, right? Then how is it that I'm any worse than this person who just, owing to some contingency, owing to some twist of luck, managed to be here before 1990? So there's a lot of envy, there's resentment, right, and heartburn. Then there are people who lose their VP Singh cards, who I spoke to again, and who got FIRs to replace their VP-Sync cards. Then there were people who got their card counterfeited because they felt it's not fair that my daughter is not getting compensation. She has got married and left the cluster, but she should also get a plot, right? She should also get compensation. So there are people who counterfeited their card. So this is what the VP-Sync card looks like. And so then you have people who resort to practices like this. So there was a man who lost his VP-Sync card in a fire, and he waited for the embers to settle down. Then he saw a fragment of that card, then he laminated it, and then he attaches it with all his other documents, and it's a personal archive. So these are the means of ingenuity that people employ to be able to show that they belong, that they too have stakes in the city. Now I'm just going to move on to the last phase in my history and quickly conclude. So I'm not going to talk much about the Aadhaar today, actually. Surprise, surprise. So all I have to say is, but I actually did a bit of field work here too. I spent something like 8 months looking at these 3 field sites, Aadhaar enrollment camps in North Delhi. I also spent some time in the Department of Food and Supplies in Delhi. And I spent 8 months in a bus terminal in North Delhi where I spoke to rural migrants, and in this case, a community of bus porters who worked in this terminal. So the larger question that I worked with was this: can a universal ID ease rural migrants into urban welfare networks? I'm not going to give you much context about the Aadhaar. I'm going to assume that, that which impinges on you in that critical, unignorable sense is not something that needs too much context. But just to tell you, just to kind of give you an overview, we know that Aadhaar is a central piece of an electronic era, right? And that there are certain claims that are made about how Aadhaar is a foolproof and an unassailable identity authentication mechanism, which is based on certain things like how information is stored in the cloud, how there are biometrics that are being stored, and how there's deduplication that is carried out against a central database, right, which is a central identities data repository. Now, so while we have all of that, what we also are seeing is a paradox of how on the one hand you have centralized databases, but on the other hand you have this phenomenon of privatized information gathering, right, which is to say that the people who do document verification, the people who create the verification architecture, the ecosystem for the Aadhaar, the people who provide database services, all of these are in private hands, right? And so what are the implications of that? And implications are many. And so for me, the important question was, do rural migrants, the community of bus porters I was interviewing over a long period of time, for them, is a universal ID even desirable? And is it something that that helps them in their urban struggles, right? And in that, I found that, and I'm going to quickly summarize all these points. On the one hand, there's a problem just in terms of getting enrolled for the Aadhaar, right? And the problem was that if you look at the software, Aadhaar software, the computer operator who sits at the enrollment camp, what he cannot help but tell you as an applicant, he will tell you, look, you have to give me proof of identity and proof of address which matches with the data fields that I have, right? It has to match with all these things that I have already entered, right, hard-coded into my software, right? And so there are some unconventional documents like that. People who are undocumented, people who are marginal can come up with. They can produce, for instance, a Tehsildar's proof of address, or they can give an MLA's proof of identity. But an MLA cannot give a proof of address. A Tehsildar cannot give a proof of identity. So these are some of the larger intensely material issues that porters had to deal with. The other issues that they had to deal with, and just they felt that there was a strong evidentiary bias against them because in address terms, the Aadhaar did nothing to alleviate some of their struggles, right? And So that you could see that many of them were trying to get concessional bank loans, for instance, and there they couldn't because the Aadhars that they acquired eventually all showed them to be residents in back in their villages and not in Delhi. And most of the porters I interviewed were not from Delhi, right? And they were from rural backgrounds, and they spent some time back home and other time working as porters here, right? Then, but the bigger problem is also this. So they had to link their Aadhaar with the caste certificate, and there, in order to get a caste certificate, now you have to have an Aadhaar, right? And that also set them back. And interestingly, you know that different states have different castes, right? They have this list of castes which keeps changing over time also. So you can have newer castes which enter the list of SCs, STs, and OBCs. So a caste that is recognized as SC in Uttar Pradesh is not a caste that is recognized as SC in Delhi. And this happened when a porter, for instance, tried to get a bank loan which is tied to his caste. He was a Kumhar, and he was a Kumhar which is recognized as an SC in Uttar Pradesh but not in Delhi. And Aadhaar did nothing to really help him in this sense. Anyway, so I'm concluding, and sorry I took up so much of your time. Just to conclude, I just wanted to say that what we can see here is a certain temporal shift, a certain historical shift, right, in the very notion of proof, right? What we earlier had, a particular popular stake, right, to proof is something that is disappearing now. People had some ownership over how they could be identified. I'm not saying that they had complete control, but they did have a say in how they could be identified, how they could be documented, which is now no longer the case because the question of who identifies them is now dispersed and is in various hands. It's not in the hands of the government alone. It's not in the hands of one government department. It's in the hands of private firms. It's in the hands of the World Bank. It's in the hands of several other authorities, right? And there's not much, but interestingly, there's also not too much separation of those who implement, those who come up with the verification architecture for Aadhaar, those who are strong advocates for the Aadhaar, those who make a strong case for how Aadhaar is the best digital standard that we should all go for, and we need electronic consent which will expedite all transactions. So there's not much separation either, and at the same time there's not much control that people can wield over how they can identify themselves. And unfortunately, the ultimate alibi, right, against fraud, against impersonation, has become a number, an iris, a fingerprint. And you know how these things cannot be coaxed, they can't be petitioned, they can't be appealed to. And on that note, I just conclude.
In the interest of time, we'll take a few questions, maybe work for 5 minutes. Is there any questions from the audience?
Yeah. I'll keep my answers brief so that there can be more questions.
I was interested in what you were talking about, the differences in the rationing for Dalits and the upper caste.
I was speaking of differences in the identification of Dalit refugees and upper caste
I think
refugees.
before that you were talking about how Dalits would
Ration,
lower
right.
Was there a difference in the type of ration card that was issued so that they could identify that these are Dalits?
Dalits.
Was it designed differently, maybe different?
No, it was not. So you didn't have any caste-based ration cards or rationing documents that were issued. You had very uniform kind of rationing genres across different castes. So the interesting thing then is how is it that discrimination occurs in spite of legally uniform rights, right? Legally uniform measures and entitlements. That's what becomes very important to establish.
That this practice was happening by the people who were providing the rations. at
Right.
the distribution
That's
center.
right. That's absolutely right.
And the Dalits had legal recourse to that or not? The fact that they weren't getting what was...
So the thing is, often you notice that, and this is true even today, right? I mean, you obviously would know that untouchability has continued to this day and has taken different forms, and caste discrimination takes different forms today, right? And so often the nature of caste-based dynamics of power is such that you're not in a place where you can protest against this, right? I mean, especially when the person who's giving you rations is also your landlord, right? So in those senses, you can't really protest. So there are several instances of that, manifestations of that even now, right? Yeah.
Continuing about the whole refugee status and the urban displaced quarters.
Yeah.
So we could add on more to that. I mean, how would they get by?
How did they?
How would they get through it? I mean, there was a huge difference, right? So how did they manage? How did they mitigate it?
When you say difference?
I mean, as in like with respect to getting their rations on time and all.
Okay.
Because
so,
they missed out on it, right?
Okay. So are you interested in the rationing process, or are you interested in the rehabilitation and the housing compensation of refugees? Because these are two different stories.
The housing.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So there was a ministry called the Ministry of Relief and Rehabilitation, which later was called just the Ministry of Rehabilitation. So the Ministry of Rehabilitation had different branches in different urban centers, mainly in places like Delhi and Bengal, for instance, West Bengal. So in Delhi, how it went down was like this. So you had surveys and censuses being carried out, and there were several surveys and censuses that were carried out, and it all varied. There were surveys of refugees that were carried out. Then there were surveys of refugee squatters that were carried out. There were different surveys of people residing on certain kinds of government land, certain kinds of Nazul land. I mean, there are different categories which I will not get into. So then, then there's also an officer called the Housing Rent Officer, HRO. Housing Rent Officer would also be responsible for carrying out smaller surveys, where he would kind of go to these, approach these refugees and then get their documents, right? And he'd present that. But what is important in all of this is that refugee associations played a great role in determining even the kinds of questions that were asked in censuses, right? So they would actually guide authorities and say, these kinds of questions will enable us to provide proof to you better, right? So there, and there's also a squatter's identification document that was issued. And it's actually very interesting. There's a squatter ID. I unfortunately don't have a slide for that. But so the squatter had to like get his photograph, and then she would have to carry like this board which had her number or his number jotted down on this like blackboard sort of thing, and then there would be a photograph of that, and then the corresponding number would also be noted down in records. So this was actually done back in the early 1960s. So this is one of the earliest kind of squatter ID document that you have. Right.
We'll take one last question from there, and then
yeah,
we can continue afterwards.
We can combine both those questions. Like I can just.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you very much for the impressive presentation. I'm just intrigued by your last line, because it seems the whole notion of proof and identity is becoming more and more impersonal, more and more digital, and the whole notion of identity is being sort of wrested by a big state or whatever you want to call it. So can you elaborate a little bit on the last line? Thank you.
Right. Okay. Should I just combine it? Should I take both questions and answer? Yeah.
The question of the question of ID is tied to the recognition of citizenship, and the entitlements of citizenship are assured by a doctrine of human rights. Now, those rights are, the current doctrine we have is conceptualized only at the scale of the nation state, which is abstracted from the routines of daily life. So we seem to need a reconceptualization of rights at various spatial scales and down to the level of the city. So I was wondering if that's something I've reflected on, or is there anyone who has been reflecting on it?
Okay. So first up, the question. So what I had in mind was that, so if you to look at it, there are any number of agencies that are in this whole business of proving who Indians are, right? And you only need to read the writings of activists, right, who worked in this space, like Usha Ramanathan, Ritika Khera, and they will tell you about how you don't own your own information, right? And they tell you about there is a reason why it is know your customer. It is not know your citizens, it is know your customer. It is not. So if you to look at the language, if you to look at who has control over the language, if you to look at the several entities that have come together in the production of digital identity and the consolidation of digital identities, and who benefit the most from it also. So it's actually interesting that, you know, you will find strange kinds of correspondences, right? So the person who is head of technology in UIDA will also have some Khosla labs, will also be part of Khosla labs, which is providing some sort of again database services or something along those lines. So in all those senses, there is like this very close knit, but also in many senses it's also shabby, right? Because there are all kinds of slippages, all kinds of mistakes, all kinds of inefficiencies. We need to take that on board also. These are people who are totally convinced of electronic consent. They are totally convinced that one needs to expedite things, and that efficiency and that government savings, all of this can happen only when, only through these kinds of mechanisms. And activists have shown that, look, government savings, if at all they happen for other reasons, because people can't link their Aadhaar to their bank accounts, or because they've been, many of them have shown to have died when there's actually a story of Rajasthan's pensioners who have been shown to be dead when many of them are alive, because the government database, they couldn't enter the government database, and they couldn't make a switch from post office savings to savings accounts to bank savings accounts. So you have all these stories. So in all those senses, the stories of failures are not not enough to convince authorities. And the coaxing, the petitioning is happening in court, and court alone, right? And nowhere else. That's what I had in mind. As for you, questions of human rights and questions of, can you just repeat that part? Because there's one very interesting part where you talked about spatializing. Can you just repeat that part?
I was saying that the current doctrine of human rights we have is conceptualized only at the scale of the nation state. And that is a scale which is abstracted from the routines of everyday life. And we need a reconceptualization at the scale of the city. But the stability of identity which can be held at the nation state, which is held by the protocols of immigration, will not work in the city which thrives on migration and mobility. So we need a reconceptualization of rights.
Absolutely. So it's actually, if you were to look at, if I were to look at my own field work to answer your question, so for instance, the VP Singh enumeration initiative that I was speaking to you about, some of the conversations that I've had with the people who are the subjects of this initiative. So many of them had to fight all sorts of intense proof-related struggles, right? So this is something that they had to face up to, even when there was no mandate on them, pressing down on them to produce proof. So the question that I posed, which is, how is it that this initiative even played itself out, right? Given that officials could not ask for proof. So they ended up looking at all sorts of cultural markers. They looked at all sorts of extra documentary markers of who a slum resident was, right? So they would actually, so officials would go into a slum residence and then look for proof of a working kitchen, right? So is there a stove that is being used? Is there grime against the wall to show that the stuff is being used? So in all those senses, you have slum residents who were unable to demonstrate that that they had functional homes with functional kitchens. Then any kind of cloth partitions were seen to be suspect because is this just one house that is pretending to be two households? And so there were all sorts of probing questions posed, which when you are to try and think of IDs simply within a larger framework or within a larger setting like the nation, these kinds of questions are not going to be, they don't elicit the kind of answers that you hope to find, right? So, and that's exactly what I wanted to do in this book. I wanted to displace the nation as the episteme, as the larger frame of analysis, right? So, and there's other ways in which I can answer your question, but that will take up time. Yeah.
Okay. We'll probably take more questions outside if Tarangini has a little bit of time, but let's thank her again. Thank you.